In this section, you'll learn about remote access administration. To put it bluntly, we don't always have the ability to walk up to a server, a virtualization host, or a virtual machine and log in interactively. And in some cases, we might have the ability, but just lack the desire. It's easier to remotely administer these systems from our desk. We'll be discussing how to remotely connect to hypervisors using remote administrative consoles. We'll also discuss how to use the standard remote desktop protocol or secure shell to make those connections. And finally, be looking at the newer capabilities in Windows PowerShell to utilize PowerShell remoting in a Windows environment. So we've discussed the fact that monitoring the environment is a really integral piece to successfully implementing cloud computing, and so is responding to alerts. But being able to remotely access and troubleshoot a virtualization host or a virtual machine is also very much part of the process. Okay? It's convenient in many scenarios. It requires less time. It makes fixing and maintaining the environment just simply easier to accomplish. When you think about it, remotely accessing a server is sometimes necessary. For instance, remote access to public cloud hosted resources. I can't go visit the Azure data center and log on to the server, nor would I want to. It would take too much time. But there are other times where it doesn't mean accessing a server that's in an offsite location. There are times when simply connecting to an internal virtualization host or an internal virtualization virtual machine, is simply more convenient. Remotely, at least, it's simply more convenient than physically walking over to the server and logging in. You got a quick fix, you got a change that needs to be made. Being able to access that machine from the local workstation save you time and prevents you from having to walk or drive over to the data center. All right. So remote administration has always been an advantage. And it doesn't matter if you're in a cloud environment or not. Let's go through some of the ways in which you can remotely access and administer cloud computing resources. As we'll see going through, there are a number of ways that you can access and remotely connect to hypervisors. Most vendors will provide a console, a remote administrative console that can be installed on the workstation or server. And these are systems that are not the hypervisor. Okay, so these are remote admin tools that you can install in order to make a remote connection. Essentially, it allows a user to connect to the hypervisor from the workstation or server. Often these are called administrative clients, but they might also be called jump machines or step machines. In other words, it's just a machine that you're using as an administration jump point. You're using it to jump over to another server. That's where the terminology comes from, in order to manage that other server. Now, more recently, in relation to this kind of concept, sometimes these administrative clients are kept highly secure. And so users, for instance, in the IT department would not use their standard system to be able to connect. They would be required to use an administrative account on a jump system in order to connect to that server. It does allow for multiple hypervisors to be added into a single console on the workstation, and so that has then the ability to perform almost all administrative tasks, managing hypervisors from within a single console. So they will be able to do most of the things that they could do if they connected directly to the hypervisor. There will be some limitations, but the vast majority of administrative tasks you can do. Now keep in mind, it is still going to require administrative permissions on those remote machines. So just because they use the console to connect to it doesn't mean that I'm bypassing any sort of security. I would have to have administrative rights on that hypervisor. But using a console from a workstation is a great way to connect to the host because quite honestly, it looks and acts just like it would if you were locally logged on to that hypervisor host. Now, another option that we have is the remote desktop protocol. Specifically in Windows environments, RDP will differ from installing the hypervisor console on a workstation because it allows me to remotely connect and log in directly to the hypervisor. So it allows me to log into the Windows operating system as if I were logged on locally. RDP provides remote display and input capabilities over the network, and it does require RDP client software in order to do this. However, RDP client software is included in every version of Windows. We see the screenshot, probably all at least somewhat familiar with using RDP to make that connection, something that needs to be enabled on the server, but once enabled will allow me to make the connection pretty easily. It does allow me also to connect local resources. Now, some of these are just things like the clipboard and printers and whatnot. What's most helpful is the drives. So if I connect my local disk drives to the remote machine through RDP, then I have the ability to copy data to and from the hypervisor if and when that is necessary. Using the remote desktop connection, you can also save your connections and settings, and those settings, as you see, can include the administrative credentials, the username. Now, it's best to have it come up and ask you for a password each time you try to connect, as opposed to just saving both username and password. But you can really save yourself a lot of time saving RDP files to the desktop, being able to double-click them very quickly and easily, and connect to the remote hypervisors. Another option that we have for remote access administration is Secure Shell, or SSH. This provides a secure method of remotely managing network devices, which can include hypervisor hosts, although typically they would be hypervisors running on the Linux operating system. SSH is using public key cryptography to exchange a symmetric key, which is one key that is used to both encrypt and decrypt the data. It's also referred to as a private key. The problem with private key encryption is that the private key has to be distributed, while SSH uses public key cryptography to covertly exchange the private key between an SSH client and SSH server, okay? Which essentially is the exact same way that SSL will function. And what it does is it gives us a channel, a pretty quick and secure channel, and gives administrators remote logon capabilities along with customization. That customization includes the ability to authenticate the users, which typically we would do in addition to the encryption, along with different levels of encryption that are required in mutual authentication. SSH was designed to replace RSH, remote shell, because RSH sends unencrypted traffic over the network, making it an unsecured transmission and really not ever recommended even in an internal virtualization environment. Now, mind you, with all of these, both SSH and RDP, it's never recommended to have a hypervisor that is directly exposed to the internet. So we always want a hypervisor host installed behind a firewall or some other form of protection. It makes it more difficult to access the hypervisor off-site. SSH and RDP ports can be opened up, port 22 for SSH, 3389 for RDP, in order to allow access to that hypervisor host from off-site locations. The primary difference there happens to be which virtualization platform you're using. That's going to determine which of those protocols that you use. Now, another option for remotely accessing the hypervisor host machine is through a web console, and that's using HTTP or HTTPS. Many of the hypervisor vendors will have a web console that allows the administrator to access the host from essentially anywhere. Okay? Obviously, there we would want HTTPS because that's going to encrypt traffic, and then you would be able to connect and perform some administrative task in that way. Ultimately, the remote access method of administration that you choose will depend on the virtualization platform, as well as the level of security that you require and the specific tasks that you are trying to do. The HTTP web pages are not going to provide all of the management capabilities that RDP would, although the administrative consoles have less complexity than RDP when it comes to the actual connection and enabling of the feature. and they will provide the vast majority of administrative tasks. So it's a choice that you will have to make as a cloud professional, but it's important to understand all of the different options. And speaking of all of the different options, I almost forgot the last option. The last option is Windows PowerShell. Windows PowerShell is only supported on Hyper-V host. It is a Windows component. And as such, you may not actually see it on the certification exam, but for those of us that are using Hyper-V, I think we would be remiss not to mention Windows PowerShell. PowerShell is the command line administrative tool, started in Windows Server 2008 and is extended on to the current version, Windows Server 2016 and Windows 10. PowerShell does provide both local and remote administrative control. The module or collection of commands for Hyper-V contains 183 commandlets in it. They can be used to manage the local hypervisor. They can also be used in context of PowerShell remoting to manage a remote hypervisor. All right, but you are going to need those additional commandlets, and those additional commandlets are going to be a part of what are called the remote server admin tools. You can install it directly from Server Manager on a Windows server that is not a hypervisor. You can install it by downloading the RSAT and then add remove Windows components on a Windows client workstation. That makes those commandlets available to you. Once they're available to you, then you can create remote sessions with a hypervisor in order to pass commands to the hypervisor. You can also maintain persistent sessions. So PowerShell remoting is going to work as one-to-one or one-to-many. In this case, a lot of it will be one-to-one. The question is, do you want to execute one command against a remote system, or do you want to establish and maintain a session so that you can always fire commands at that remote system? Gather information, modify the configuration, any and all of that can be done. Once again, I said you have 183 commandlets in the Windows PowerShell module for Hyper-V. So there's nothing that you can't do via the command line. The command line gives us an automated approach, which is preferable to some. So if you find yourself in a Windows environment utilizing the Hyper-V virtualization platform, then please don't forget about the existence of Windows PowerShell, because Windows PowerShell will be a great option for you for both local and remote administration. In this section, we learned about the importance of remote access administration. Having the ability to connect remotely to virtualization host can assist in troubleshooting particular situations, or is just easier to configure. It's more convenient in these scenarios and sometimes required. Obviously, as we discussed, if you're connecting to public cloud-hosted resources, you must remotely access it. But even with internal virtualization hosts and virtualization machines, it's desirable. So you have the options of remote administrative consoles that allow you to connect to the hypervisors through that console itself. You have remote desktop protocol, which allows you to connect remotely to the machine as if you were logged on locally. If you're running non-Microsoft operating systems, we may use SSH or HTTP. And then back to the Microsoft operating systems, we discussed the use of PowerShell remoting. Which one will you choose? Well, as a cloud professional, it's up to you, but it's also important for you to understand all of the different options.